Good morning. I am so honored to be here at Tulane University and also honored to be back in my beloved hometown of New Orleans and also to be with these distinguished authors, scholars, public intellectuals, opinionated people with purpose and cause today. So I want to thank Tulane University. I certainly want to thank Cheryl Landrew and the entire team of people who put this book festival together. My presence here is 2 years delayed because COVID interrupted the plans for this for 2 years in a row. But we're glad to be here, and let's get this conversation started. So I want to begin. We are going to talk today about the original sin of America, and that sin is the legacy of slavery. And just as a important note, I've been immersed in this conversation and in this discussion through a project that I'm working on now, and that is the new National Urban League headquarters building in Harlem, which is going to have New York's first ever civil rights museum. And that museum is going to focus with some specificity on the northern experience of African Americans. And it is not widely understood that slavery did exist in the northern part of the United States. Not to the extent that it existed in the South, but the institution, the legacy of the peculiar institution also existed in the North all the way until the 1800s. So I've got some distinguished people with me today. I am going to give each of them just a minute. I want you to simply, this is what, Charles, just tell them a little bit about yourself and what inspires your incredible work today.
Oh, impossible question. My name is Charles Blow. I am an op-ed columnist at the New York Times. I have a nightly show on the Black News Channel. I'm the author of 2 books. One is Fire Shut Up My Bones, which has been developed into an opera. And the second is The Devil You Know. News on that coming soon.
Highly recommend.
And inspiration is, I guess it is the Baldwin inspiration, which is that, I think of myself as bearing witness, and that someone has to record the particular experience as I see it, and only I can do that.
Hey, Freddie.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Freddie Evans, and I am an independent scholar as well as an arts educator. My work is centered on Congo Square here in New Orleans, although I do write for children as well as for adults. And I was inspired because of the lack of information on Congo Square that was available to the public. When I first looked at the topic, there were articles published in historical journals, but they were not, again, accessible to the general public. And so my effort really began with children, writing for children, but I found out that adults needed it as well. So I have published 2 books on Congo Square. One is Congo Square, African Roots in New Orleans, and the second one is Come Sunday, A Young Reader's History of Congo Square.
Fantastic. Joshua?
My name is Josh Rothman. I teach history at the University of Alabama. I've taught history at the University of Alabama since the year 2000, which, yeah, that seems like a long time. Doesn't feel like a long time, but it seems like a long time. I've written 3 books on the history of American slavery. The most recent one is The Ledger and the Chain, which is a history of the domestic slave trade and domestic slave traders. And I confess I don't know that I've ever really thought or been asked about what my inspiration is or what inspires me. I think what sort of motivated me to write the books that I've written over the course of my career is, in some ways, sort of what you were talking about with regard to slavery in the North, right? These are they're stories and sort of components of American slavery that people think they know, but don't know. And I suppose what inspires me is the ability to uncover and tell those stories and make them more available to a wide audience.
Josh, I want to let you know you're a wise man. You came to Tulane University wearing Tulane University colors, camouflaging your allegiance to the University of Alabama.
I'm going to pretend that was on purpose.
Here in Louisiana. I want to begin with you, Charles, because in The Devil You Know, you not only talk about your own life and upbringing as a journalist, as a student at Grambling, and as a son of Louisiana, growing up in a small town in North Louisiana. But I was struck by the power theory that you posited, which sort of begins with the impact of the Great Migration, and the impact of the Great Migration on the southern United States and the southern black experience as contraposed to the northern black experience. And I think it would be helpful for the audience maybe to just set up some of the facts and figures around the Great Migration, but then talk about that, because it was transformative, because while immigration from Western and Eastern Europe were taking place to many northern industrial cities, the Great Migration was also shaping those communities. You want to talk about that?
Right. I position that argument in Black Power specifically because at the end of the Civil War, 3 southern states were majority black. Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. There were another 2 or 3 that were in 2 percentage points. Florida was in 4 percentage points. And because of that, and because of Reconstruction, black people enjoyed an incredible amount of power in that 12 years. Some of the former, the Confederates, didn't want to participate in government at all. You crushed us, you shamed us, all these black people are now allowed to participate. I don't have anything to do with it. For whatever reason, Mississippi, for instance, had I think 60% of their voting population was black men. There were no women voting at the time. There were black men registered to vote. And the other 40% were white men. And so that changed everything. It is the reason that Mississippi produces our first 2 black senators, and then you have this drought for decades before you get another. And it is also the reason why the violence starts and exists for so long, and kind of culminates in that period with the calling of constitutional conventions in those southern states to write white supremacy into the DNA of those states, right? So it ends up being that people leave the South, on the one hand, because of racial terror, but they had stayed in the South with the racial terror for 50 years, right? So they didn't leave right away as soon as the Constitutional Conventions were held and they were restricted and their votes were restricted and lynching soared. They stayed. But when the cotton crop collapsed with the infestation of the boll weevil, it was not only am I being terrorized, I can't put food on the table, right? And so the combination of those 2 things and northern factories sending recruits down to the South saying, hey, it is a dearth of workers in the North. A lot of these young white men have gone off to fight in World War I. We need people in these factories. Why are you putting up with this? And so a few adventurous souls in the beginning say, why not? And that creates a domino effect and people leave because of that. But one of the other things that it does, one of the kind of tangential effects of that is that it dilutes the black population. Instead of 90% of the black population living in the South, now a certain percentage lives in Illinois, and a certain percentage lives in Michigan, a certain percentage lives in New York, but none of those come anywhere close to being majority or even a controlling interest, right? And so that kind of state power, the possibility of state power, vanishes. And so the proposal in this book is that it doesn't have to vanish. You have a giant head start in Mississippi with 40% of the population being black. You have a giant head start in Georgia with 33% of the population being black, and on and on and on. And it only takes a relatively small amount of migrants to shift the power structure of the South.
And Georgia 2020 was sort of Exhibit A.
Georgia was,
because
right.
of the transformation of metropolitan Atlanta's population.
Absolutely.
Really significantly in the last 20, but in the last 10 years.
Absolutely. The last time a Democrat run Georgia was 1992 with Bill Clinton. Black people were only 25% of the population. In the 2020 election, they were 33% of the population. The black population of
including
Georgia doubles.
a population of Latinos and Asians.
Right. But specifically, the black population doubles from 1.7 million black people in 1990 to 3.4 plus million black people,
And continues to grow.
And continues to grow, and that is what flipped Georgia.
Yeah. So, Freddie, the Great Migration period, the Reconstruction and the Great Migration period, Charles has talked about. One of the things that in your work that you make clear is that the system of subjugation, oppression, and suppression also involve laws, practices, and customs to subjugate and oppress the natural cultural expressions of Africans who were enslaved in the United States. And later, during Reconstruction, continued efforts to do that. Maybe you could paint a picture, because I think that element of, which may have a unique nature or unique, if you will, historical footnote here in New Orleans, because of our history, is not well known.
Yes. As you said, there was oppression on every hand. The enslaved Africans who were brought had been stripped of everything that was familiar to them. They're separated from their country, from their loved ones, even their physical attire, aboard those ships. We may see clothing in movies, but they did not have them. But there was something inside that the slaveholders could not take away, and that was their culture, their songs, their ways of cooking, their music, their religious belief systems. And that's what they brought to Congo Square. So at Congo Square, and it was not just isolated at Congo Square that they were able to express those cultural practices, but we know from the long history and the large numbers there that did influence the cultural practices and the way that they integrated and influenced what we know today as New Orleans indigenous culture. But not just New Orleans, but also the culture of the nation and the world. But it was there that they were able to freely dance and perpetuate their rhythmic patterns and build or create instruments or play them the way that they had known in their homeland. So it was those kinds of opportunities around the country, but particularly in Congo Square. And Congo Square was the place in North America where this was able to happen in the open longer than any other place. So we can go to Congo Square as a reference point to see how the African culture integrated with other influences that enslaved people had encountered, other cultural practices, and then end up with a new way of expressing themselves, indigenous cultures that we know of today.
One thing, Freddie, you do in your book that was revealing to me, not in the sense that there was an extensive effort in the early 1800s, after the Americanization of Louisiana, for those in power to pass laws, issue proclamations and executive orders to ban enslaved Africans and from participating in dance rituals, from beating of drums, from gathering to dance. There was a long and extensive effort, and this is important to continue to focus on, and that is the way the law was used as the instrument of oppression. Local laws, city ordinances, municipal executive orders, proclamations. And I read in your book that a Mayor Gerard, who a street is named after in a central business district, actually sort of came up with the notion that these laws should be suspended on Sundays at Congo Square, thus creating a place, because even as the celebrations took place at Congo Square, it was not uncommon for the cultural expressions to take place all over town, on the levees, spontaneously. So I think you contribute a great deal to the understanding of the way in which this system of subjugation was so extensive.
Yes, I would like to add, just follow what you were saying. Many believe that every Sunday enslaved people were able to gather in Congo Square, and initially at other locations before Congo Square became the sole location. That's not true.
Right.
It was intermittent. It was off and on, depending on the people who were in power at that time, depending on whether there was an uprising or even a rumor of an uprising. Those dances, those opportunities were automatically taken away from enslaved people. So again, laws were used to create or to subjugate, to control the expressions and ability to come together.
Josh, you talk about the domestic slave trade, and we all understand and know that slavery was in effect an economic system, a global economic system, an economic system of the so-called Western world. Can you characterize the extent, the size, the nature, the wealth that that system created for slave owners and those who participated in that industry or in that system?
I could try. Probably the single statistic that stands out the most in people's minds when I talk about these things is that if you calculated the wealth that is literally embodied by 4 million enslaved people in 1860, if you took all of the money that Americans had invested then in manufacturing, banks, railroads, add it all together, enslaved people were still valued at more than that. Enslaved people were worth more in 1860 than all of the money in circulation in the country. It's almost impossible to characterize the sort of wealth that spun off from enslaved people, right? Because it's not just a matter of, well, what is an enslaved person worth monetarily in the market, right? Because enslaved people are assets, they can also be used for mortgages. They can be used as security for other forms of property. They can be, in some cases, particularly in places where there's not a lot of cash around, they can be used as currency. And of course, everybody benefits from that except for enslaved people themselves, right? I mean, the money concentrates in the hands of slaveholders, but it spins off into all sorts of other areas of the economy, right? Because, I mean, just take something like the domestic slave trade. Slave traders rely on carpenters and blacksmiths and provisioners and midwives and doctors and lawyers, and all of those people are essentially benefiting in one way or another from the institution of slavery. So, slavery isn't everything about the American economy before the Civil War, but it's a deeply significant constituent part of it, and it's almost impossible to sort of extract that and imagine what does the economy look like instead.
So, come 1860, and more particularly 1865, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, what happened to those domestic slave owners? How did they
to slave
react?
holders or to slave traders?
The slave traders.
Well, they go out of business.
Act and react. What was their response?
They don't really have any kind of systematic response, right? I mean, their business is essentially eliminated as a sector of the American economy. Now, the money that they've stashed away in the meantime isn't really eliminated. Everything that they have sort of generated along the way isn't eliminated, right? I mean, this is the thing about what happens when slavery ends, right? Enslaved people are wiped out as an asset class, right? And instead, they're able to take possession of their own labor value. But there's nothing that's ever done to deal with sort of everything that had happened in the decades and the centuries before that. For slave traders, it really depends on sort of what other assets they've managed to accumulate, right? But for slave holders, the most significant thing that they hold on to is their land. There's never really any systematic land redistribution done after 1865. And so even though slaveholders have really what was usually their most significant asset wiped off the books. Because they hold land, they have arguably the most significant leverage over that labor value that black people now have for themselves. Well, where are they going to put it? And often the answer is they put it back into the land that's owned by former slaveholders.
You know, it's another issue close to me. My family on my mother's side is from the Whitney Plantation, which is now a museum to recognize the enslaved community. And my two ancestors, Victor and Anna Heidel, were actually freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. They were slaves on that plantation, as there were many, 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 many slaves on that plantation. And of course, they were, Victor was rather prolific with a lot of children. His sons had a lot of children, and they created a very large community. Some of them became sharecroppers, and I just recently learned how one of them actually lost their land. And they lost their land because the common practice was to borrow money in the planting season and pay it back in the harvest. So if you had a bad harvest season and couldn't pay back the loan you took out during the planting season, you might lose your land. And they effectively lost their land, and that's one of the things that compelled them to move to New Orleans in really the late 1800s, including the effort to sort of get away from what was occurring with the collapse of Reconstruction. Charles, the current situation in this country has eerie and striking parallels sometimes to Reconstruction and its aftermath. And you write a lot on the issues that we confront today. You comment on it, you speak on it. Offer a perspective of today's challenges versus the challenges then, and lessons we need to understand and learn if we don't want to repeat.
The eeriness is not only to Reconstruction, it's also to slavery itself. When slavery is ended, you basically enter into a quasi-slavery, right, where the government becomes a partner in the enslavement. So people would be arrested for no reason whatsoever, and they would be leased out as convict leasing, what they called it. And basically, the plantations basically had a labor force. Again, they didn't have to be in possession of the enslaved people. They didn't have to care for them. They didn't have to have, infirmary on the land, because they were basically coming from the jailer on back onto the property. So that continues.
All these vagrancy
right, all of that, right, so slavery essentially continues because of the clause in the 14th Amendment, what's it, 13th Amendment?
14th.
The 14th Amendment.
13.
Is it 13? I always get this mixed up.
13.
That says, you can't be compelled to do this unpaid labor unless you are convicted, right? So we continue it, and so what is fascinating to me, in preparation for coming to this, I was rereading Frederick Douglass's narratives of being being enslaved. I hate the word slave. Being enslaved, and I might have read that in college or something, because everything felt fresh to me, and it's very spooky, right? Because what he's saying is he's pointing out what you were pointing out, which is that it's a massive economy, and it is debased capitalism, right? That you have to, in some way, construct in your mind that these are not human beings in the same way that I am, to allow myself to do it. That enslavement not only debased the enslaved, it debased the enslaver, right? That you had to change your mind. It also made hypocrisy out of your religion. These people prayed every night, prayed every morning, and then went out and were vicious and brutal to the enslaved.
I believe it was Pope Leo, correct me someone, in the 1500s, who in effect sanctioned the Spanish colonials' participation in the slave trade, I believe. And I may have the Pope's name wrong, but it is important that you make a good point. We could spend a lot of time talking about the role of religion and the argument that Christianity supported. Look, my own fourth grade history book in this city said, and I quote, that Europeans came to the New World to Christianize the heathenish Native Americans, and that slavery was a system to, if you will, civilize the treacherous, dangerous peoples of Africa. I mean, this stuff was being taught, you know, in American history through references in American history books. I remember that from fourth grade. I remember how it made me feel. I remember how it made me burn. And that's why I can remember it to this exact day. And so I think it's an important dynamic element. Freddie, I want to talk, because I think this issue, when you talk about Congo Square, it's the broader issue of culture. Mm-hmm. And the effort to suppress and oppress African culture through laws and customs, but then the ability and the determination to both retain it and celebrate it, right? Mm-hmm. And this may not necessarily be in your book. I'd like your thoughts about how cultural expressions and music and artistic expressions became tools of freedom and liberation, became a method to both communicate as well as to express the feelings and the hopes and the aspirations.
Yes, well, Congo Square was a location of resistance as well as celebration. Mm-hmm. So when we see throughout the primary documents, throughout the first-hand accounts, that even into the 1850s, before the gatherings ended, that although European practices had been introduced in musical instruments like the violin and songs like Carry Me Back to Virginia, there were still people, there were still gatherers there who perpetuated their African traditions, their African cultural practices. And we know from the musical instruments that they played, the songs and the rhythmic patterns, that those continued. So we see the resistance, and that was what fueled the continuation and the perpetuation of the practices, and eventually allowed them to be integrated to create these new forms. So I think at the basis of it, we see a history of resistance.
And Josh, I often, in your studies, there were instances of quote unquote slavery in human history, prisoner of war style slavery, spoils of war style slavery. Has there been a system in humankind that equates to the system of American slavery in its scope? Really, it's more than American slavery, because it's Western Hemispheric slavery, transatlantic slavery. Is there anything that equates to it? I mean, how do we wrap our head around whether this is, as some try to suggest, a common theme throughout history? Is it?
Yes and no. The institution of slavery is quite common throughout human history. It exists in many societies in many different parts of the world over thousands of years. But what's new and what is unique about the plantation system of the Western Hemisphere are several things. One is the invention of race to justify it. Another is making it a chattel system, where enslaved people are property, like many other forms of property, and can be used as such. And it's inheritable. It is passed down from generation to generation through the status of a person's mother, and it is legally entrenched that way. You wrap all of that together, and it makes the system of slavery that exists in the Western Hemisphere unique in global history. And so it is true technically to say that slavery has existed in many places throughout time, but it is also, there's something fundamentally dishonest about the argument. It's a sort of a sophistic argument, right? It's taking the term slavery and saying, well, that exists everywhere, so that, there's nothing different about that. There are things that are very specific and very different about that, and that have significant sort of economic and cultural and social and political ramifications that extend outward from there.
We've got about 10 minutes before we go to wrap, and I want to invite our audience to participate by going to the mic and by reminding you of the ground rules. If what you want to say is so eloquent and thorough and you'd like to be a panelist, we can make that available to you next year. This is a Q&A. Professor Powell, good to see you. Appreciate your incredible work, and the floor is yours.
Well, this is a great panel, and I just want to throw out a few factoids that I think might enrich this discussion. I don't think it's well known, but Frederick Douglass's brother was sold into New Orleans, and after the Civil War, he tried to find him, and there was like a International Red Cross finding effort going on in the newspapers, where they recently emancipated would put out ads looking for their family members that had been split up. But so Frederick Douglass was here. The other thing about slavery, I don't know if people realize that the word slaves comes from the word Slav, and some early slaves were from the Slavic countries. They were sold to Muslim markets. But I think Josh makes a brilliant point. What happened here was fundamentally different. And Josh, maybe when I get off, you might want to mention that Angola is the plantation owned probably by the most notorious and largest professional slave trader ever. And finally, I want to make a point, and I know you, Mark, you will stipulate to this, that New Orleans is a place where laws are to be evaded, not obeyed. And that's true almost from the get-go. And I think one reason that space opened up in places like Congo Square, but these, as you pointed out, these were going on in all these little backyards, small squares, forever. And what was really going on was, and I think we forget that people who came from Africa were not homogenous. It was just like Europe. They came from a multiplicity of ethnicities, and they had to negotiate that difference and come up with a culture that would be unify them. And I think that's why New Orleans is special, because here uniquely, you could get out and perform your culture, and that's one way cultures are created and reproduced and perpetuated. And I've said enough.
Thank you, Professor Powell. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Come on up. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, there was a line. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I just had a question. You were talking about the influence of Congo Square on Black art and Black culture, and I wanted to, if you could provide some more contemporary examples, or how specifically Congo Square has affected your art.
Your last part is?
Like how Congo Square has affected your art in particular.
Affected your artistry.
My artistry, oh yes. Well, how it has impacted me personally is that I began to look more closely at the contributions that enslaved Africans made beyond physical labor. I began to look at the influence of Congo Square not only on the local culture, but also nationally, especially when we're looking at the minstrels who stood at Congo Square and took the information of practices on stage at Broadway, and then the international influence as well. So it's impacted my writing in many ways, as well as my work with children on a regular basis.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Come on up. Hi.
Hello, my name is Joy Banner. I'm the Director of Communications at Whitney Plantation. I'm also part of the descendant community, and thank you. I still live in the community, in the Black descendant community, right next to Whitney Plantation. And we're in St. John the Baptist Parish, which is a part of the Cancer Alley Corridor. So Dr. Rothman, what you were saying about the connection between land and the way that money is being reinvested in that land is something that we are, that's the problem we're facing from heavy industry. At the moment, we have a huge grain terminal that is threatening Whitney Plantation as well as my descendant community. But what I wanted to talk about in terms of the land, or what I want to ask, like we're finding out that that land in question, there's more and more evidence that there are enslaved people that are on the land, and those burial grounds are unmarked. So could you just speak to the importance, your thoughts on like the recent African American Burial Ground Act that just got, I think, reintroduced? How do you feel about the importance of those laws? Are there any things that we can do as communities, especially when we're fighting industry, to protect those burial grounds?
Do you want to direct it to someone or anyone?
Just anyone.
Charles, you want to go?
Oh, I thought you said.
John?
I can take a stab at it. It's a hard question, right? Because laws are one thing, the power of industry is another thing. Look, I don't think it's hard to make a case that that burial grounds are sacred places. I think that they exist all over the place. That's the thing, right? Because they're unmarked. The land is turned over many times. People who have specific memories and knowledge of where those places are have often long since passed away. I suspect that it's not uncommon for sites like that to be discovered and simply ignored, right? Something is discovered and it's determined by various people that it's better off just not saying anything. I don't know what the answer is to try to fight that. I think that though there is power to be had, and I'd still like to believe is some sort of shared understanding that where people are buried is a sacred spot, that particularly where enslaved people have been buried and forgotten has another level to that sort of sacred nature. Again, I don't know that that's a recipe for success, but if the question is what can we do, I think leverage that to whatever extent is possible.
I think I'll say this, and Joy, one of the things your question underscores is the fact that from cradle to grave, the treatment of black people has been one of all too often oppression and subjugation. And the reason why you have all these unmarked graves is because there was no care given to how and where enslaved Africans, when they died, were buried. In some cases, there were no graveyards. They just dug a hole and put someone there, or there was an area on the plantation where the bodies were placed. And I think the understanding of that speaks to the need for us, where possible, to preserve and protect. Look, in this city, we preserve and protect buildings as historic landmarks, and that's important. But the buildings are nothing without an understanding of the people. And by the very same token, historic preservation should include that. I truly believe what that means, and there's always going to be a tension between a current landowner or current use, and that reality. But you all may remember last year, I think, Charles, you may remember during the 100th year of the Tulsa massacre, that there was an identification of a mass grave that was created, and it was only many, many years later that the grave was identified as a place where people's ancestors had been buried. But thanks for the question, Joy. And look, you got to go to the Whitney, right? If you haven't been to the Whitney, please go. If you've been, tell 10 people. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ann Flick. I guess I have to ask.
Stand a little bit closer, yeah.
I guess I have to ask, unfortunately, Mr. Laughlin again, about something that I've heard over the years. I think it's a myth, and I'd like to hear his comments on it. The myth that with no Civil War and no change, slavery would have died out.
I mean, someday. But no, I think what you often hear in that is that, well, you know, the idea is that slavery would have died out soon. There's zero evidence that that's true. If anything, in the 1850s, white Southerners, and particularly slaveholders in positions of political power, firmly believed that slavery would last forever, that it would keep growing. There were many efforts in the 1840s and 1850s to extend American sovereignty into places in Central and South America. The prices for enslaved people shot up in the 1850s. In fact, they shot up faster than the price of cotton, which was unusual. So, you know, if slavery was going to die out soon after the 1860s, there really weren't any slaveholders who believed that. So, yeah, I think that's basically a myth. Slavery surely would have died out eventually, but under what conditions, at what time, and under what terms, I don't think we have any way of knowing that.
Well, because of modern mechanization, that would have probably impacted things. But what, do you have a ballpark, some kind of thing you could throw out that?
I mean, I don't really do counterfactuals, but I would say this, right? Yeah, sure. I mean, I think things like, you know, one of the things that, you know, as Charles was talking about before, one of the impetus for the Great Migration, you know, the early stages is sort of what starts to happen to the cotton crop, but mechanized agriculture also contributes to that, right? But I would also say that industrialization, mechanization, the development of cities as a greater portion of American life, those things are not incompatible with slavery. I mean, you know, if you think about, okay, what's maybe the single thing that propels slavery forward and makes it grow, is technology. It's the cotton gin, right? The cotton gin gives new life to slavery. So the idea that technology and technological development is somehow incompatible with slavery and works against it, sometimes that's true, but it's not necessarily true.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
See, folks, some people also believe that after World War II and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there'd be no more wars of aggression. And we're witnessing that, you know, diligence requires, and I think slavery would have continued. Look, segregation would have continued, but for Brown v. Board and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. It would have continued because there was a fierce determination by some to nurture it, feed it, and sustain it. And it took a powerful intervention by people to stand it down, and notwithstanding the fact that it is stood down, we live today with its legacy, structural and institutional exclusion and discrimination and racism that exists today. And so I think it's so fascinating to me, and I'll make this other point, because when you study the history of Plessy versus Ferguson in this town, the Committee of Citizens, which brought the Plessy case, and a famous lawyer who was a member of that, Louis A. Martinet, they did not believe that they could lose. They read the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. They said, this is clear. How can we lose this case? And they lost that case. So there was a Supreme Court, which was really installed because of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, basically ignoring the plain wording of the Constitution to sanction segregation, which existed for 60 long years. The counterfactual, if you will, thought I always have, is what would have happened in this country if Reconstruction had succeeded, and if there were no Plessy case, and if the march, would there had even been a Great Migration? Perhaps not. What would be the political dynamics of the United States? It would be quite different today than it is if those things had not occurred. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Dolores McMorrin. I'm visiting
Put that mic up just a tiny bit so we can hear.
Dolores McMorrin, visiting from Georgia by way of New Jersey. So I was part of that new influx of folks in Georgia and all of that. And I visited Whitney Plantation yesterday, and yes, if you haven't, you must go. I saw your family's acknowledgement. It was, you know, the revolt that I knew nothing about, which was the famous, I mean, the history there is just fantastic. But I came away with that with so much feeling for what I saw, our history, the struggle, and then we think about what's going on today in terms of the movement, critical race theory. What are your thoughts about that in terms of the stifling of knowledge and the effect that it's going to have on our children, right, on us?
Charles?
One thing that I will say is just because you do not believe in cruelty, human cruelty, does not mean that you are a racial egalitarian. And when you are not a racial egalitarian, it opens the door for all sorts of oppression in your name as well as in other people's name who do believe in cruelty. In that way, it feels to me like we moved from an institution of slavery that completely dehumanized Africans to an institution of oppression that creates a human hierarchy where Africans and people who are non-white are towards the bottom rather than equal on an equal playing field. And so you see elements that existed, kind of frameworks, mental frameworks that existed even during enslavement that still exist. They don't have the same claw, but they still exist. So if you, to this day, can still justify running infrastructure, federal and state infrastructure through communities and destroying those communities and putting federal power plants and polluters near those communities, and you don't care, or you can put out of your mind that that is going to kill some people, cause cancer for other people, that is a problem that is born out of the same ideology. You do not see those people as equally human, and therefore you can justify that. If you can look at power and say, I can, in my mind, figure out a way to turn a blind eye to the fact that these particular people will have less power than I do. And that happens in all sorts of ways. We will undercount them in the census so that their districts won't be as full. The way the Electoral College works will not work in their favor as much as it would if we were fully counting who they were. If we do count them, we will limit their ability to vote in ways that we know directly impacts black and brown people more than other people. If they do vote, we will cluster them into districts so that no matter how many show up, if we only have all of you in 2 or 3 districts in the state, you can only elect 2 or 3 representatives, period. I don't care how many people you turn out. And if that is not enough, if that doesn't work, we will empower people on the local level to be able to throw your ballots out. Right? So all of that is born out of the same impulse. And it is rationalized in the exact same way, that these people are not human in the same way that I am. And this concept of controlling narrative and information, which is partly what this critical race theory is about, but partly it is not about that at all. Partly it is about enraging and therefore engaging suburban white women who were drifting away from the Republican Party. And they figured out that one way that you could really get them excited and angry was to tell them that something was happening in schools that they didn't know was happening. They're teaching them about sex. They're teaching them about gay people. They're teaching them they're making them feel really bad when they talk about this slavery thing. And they could engage their anger and their outrage. And that is how Youngkin won in Virginia. Right? It is the same impulse. And so for me, I just it's frustrating. And that's just a polite way to say it at a conference, but it's frustrating to see this continue to roll forward and know that it is the same ideology.
Let's give Charles Blow a big round of applause. Also, Freddie Evans, a big round of applause. And also Josh Rothman, a big round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Unfortunately, our time...